All right, everyone, it's time to talk about the French election because, of course, the first ballot is now, the projection is in. Macron and Le Pen will move to the second ballot. It was very close. It looked like Le Pen and Macron both had a few points beyond what they were actually polling at in the last round, which shows me perhaps a few people that sort of at the late stage they jumped on the Fillon bandwagon because they're like Eurosceptic or to the right, but they don't like Le Pen as much. Or they're on the left. They moved to Mélenchon. They ended up abandoning them and moving back to Macron and Le Pen, where they probably were to begin with. They would be soft supporters who moved back. Le Pen gets a little bit of a boost from the Paris attack, although it happened so close to the voting time, it may not have had a full effect. Now they have the second vote, and some people earlier on, like the MRE video even, they were commenting and saying, "Oh, Macron won. The system is rigged." He didn't win. He simply moves to the second ballot by being one of those first two-place finishers. Nobody got 50%. And there was never any chance that anyone was going to get 50%. When you've got 5 technically viable candidates, it's just not going to happen. Nobody's going to hit that threshold. The most that anyone would have gotten, even if the polls had been horribly over or undersampled in someone's favor or against them, would have been maybe 30, 31%. Far short of the hurdle they would need to reach. So now it goes to Macron-Le Pen. Now, what do I think is going to happen now? I judged that it would be Macron versus Le Pen moving to that second ballot. That has happened. But then it wasn't a stretch to imagine that. They were always polling ahead of everybody else. There was always a really good chance that was what was going to happen. Now it gets murkier, though. Fillon has apparently already come out and told his supporters to vote for Macron. That was slightly unexpected. That may deeply hurt Le Pen, actually, that he would sort of cross that line, because Macron is, of course, not a Eurosceptic. He's center-left-ish and pro-EU. Le Pen is further to the right and very Eurosceptic. Fillon is actually even further into liberalism versus sort of the collectivist side than Le Pen is, but at the same time is perhaps just as Eurosceptic. Then Mélenchon, he was communist almost, but kind of a Eurosceptic, sort of in between maybe where Fillon and Le Pen would be on that marker. What happens now is anybody's guess. It's going to be very difficult, I think. I'm not even sure that there will be polling before the next vote is held. I don't even know, I can't even recall specifically the date that the second vote is held. There may not be really time for Fillon to convince his supporters, which I assume most of them are like Eurosceptics that nonetheless don't really like Le Pen's National Socialism or too far to the right or whatever the hell they have a problem with. It may be a little bit late for that. Ship may have already sailed, so most of that support probably moves to her anyway, just based on the EU issue. But the smart money is on Macron winning. However, that doesn't mean Le Pen hasn't already scored a victory of sorts. The last time around, Front National didn't make the second ballot. She has quadrupled the support of the party, so it seems. On the second ballot, it'll be even higher. She'll probably, at the very least, she'll be in the 30s. She probably cracks 40. It'll be fairly close. It's hardly a blowout for the establishment when someone who has been branded a Nazi comes in a relatively close second place. That's not a victory for the establishment. Their best case scenario now is that they barely stave off Euroscepticism in France. Not exactly the greatest place for Macron to have to exist in, all things considered. I bet he wishes he could go back to the good old days of like the Bush era or something, when the sane centrists were all powerful and they didn't really have any significant challengers, and Front National was like, a single-digit party or something like that, like where 5th or 6th place is in this current election on the first ballot. I bet that the establishment figures their wish that, but it's no, that genie is out of the bottle. It's already happened that's probably not going to occur again. The next election around, though, with Le Pen only being in her 40s, by the way, she's by no means elderly or incapable of campaigning. She's already shown that she has lasting capabilities, and with her also outperforming at least very slightly on the first ballot, chances are she sticks around, leads the party the next time around, probably wins. The establishment that is likely to take this election under Macron cannot address the fundamental issues that drove the growth of Front National in the first place. Namely, we want either a reform of, which is impossible, so that's almost a non-issue, or out of the EU. We want sovereignty. We're tired of the immigrant and refugee crises, and certain economic issues in parts of what you could call the French Rust Belt, where Le Pen apparently has picked up a relatively massive amount of support in the northern part of France and some of these outlying industrial regions. That's not going to reverse because there's no policy that can actually be put into place. As long as France is in the EU, it's impossible to reform these things. The refugee crisis will continue. EU bureaucracy will continue. The industry of France will not come back. And so long as that's the case, the left and the right will continue to grow. But it's the right that took the second ballot position, second place on the second ballot. Most likely, she probably still doesn't lead France after this election. But she's still the one who's there. And the far left, meanwhile, takes a third place position. A virtual communist takes third place in the French election. Not another centrist, not a lesser party centrist, not someone who's kind of pro-EU and muddles around in centrism, a communist. The three main finishers here, the establishment barely clinging to its relevance, the far right, and the far left. That's what you have in France. It's what you have all over Europe. If you don't like the election results because a centrist won, like in the Netherlands, just wait another election and see what happens. Because these problems can't be addressed. Merkel holds it over everyone's head in Europe. It's not going away. More people will join Front National. More people will join the French Communist Party and a bunch of socialist movements. Most of them will be Eurosceptic movements. The center will continue to dry up over the next few years. Le Pen doesn't need to win this election. She can go out and win it next time. And it would probably be fairly easy. By then, so much support will have been pissed away by the establishment that clearly can't get anything accomplished. For the average person in France, whether they're more wealthy, less wealthy, they're urban, they're rural, they're native French, white, or they, second generation immigrant, doesn't really matter what the situation is for you in France. Things are not going to get better for you. If you think things are, a little dicey or kind of bad, you didn't vote for Macron, most likely. Unless you're terrified of the boogeyman of Front National, the Nazis, and or communists. If you're terrified by the lamestream media's made-up boogeymen, yeah, you probably voted for Macron. Maybe you voted for Fillon, and you're planning to follow Macron now because you're like, oh yeah, Euroscepticism sounds pretty good, but all this other stuff is kind of scary to me, and I'm not a leftist or something. Chances are you're not going to be backing the establishment next time either. And a whole host of others that are soft supporters of the establishment now may be pushed to the fringe by EU policy and become Front National supporters. Or maybe they become communists. Or maybe they become actual Nazis instead of nationalism light, which Le Pen represents, civic nationalism. So that's what's going to happen in France over the next few years. It's going to happen in the Netherlands. It's going to happen in Austria. You saw it in Austria. Who are the finishers? Someone who is basically green, far left, socialist, nearly a communist, versus someone who's a more literal nationalist. More of an ethno-nationalist than Le Pen, Hofer. Look at what happened in the UK. You have the total marginalizing of several parties there. The center completely erodes. You've got people who are increasingly Eurosceptic within the Tory movement. Then you have UKIP and BNP and stuff, sort of on the right, at least on those issues. And then you have the Scottish Nationals. Basically communists. They happen to be also nationalists, strangely enough. They just want Scotland to be like this far-left utopia or something like that. More power to you. If you want to rip yourselves away from the UK and become the next Cuba, go ahead. Nobody's going to stop you. Least of all the people of small-town England that probably don't want you in that union to begin with. Because you have such massive differences in your political views as a whole, honestly. It's just not going to work long-term. Sweden... Who's rising up there? Again, far left, and then you've got the Swedish Democrats, sort of civic nationalism light. Stuff like that. They don't really have a dedicated true nationalist movement in Sweden for the most part because they just can't bring themselves to do such a thing. It'd probably be illegal anyway, so it's kind of a non-issue. It's happening all over Europe. It's not going to stop because Le Pen loses an election by a few points, which she probably will. No, she probably won't win the second ballot. I would be, by the way, very happily surprised if she does. It'd be a little bit surprising. It wouldn't be the hugest surprise in all of politics. Like, I wouldn't react like the Young Turks did on election night here, with just so awestruck that for days they looked like Rubio when he had his meltdown, when he had to drop out there. Now it looked like he was just coming off of his amphetamine high, which quite clearly, by the way, little Marco was at the time. Oh, he was higher than balls when he was debating. After he no longer had to debate and he came off the pills because he didn't need the uppers anymore. Look what happened to the poor dude. No, Le Pen can win next time around. And she might win this time around. It's just a lower chance. I would look at the results of the first ballot, what Fillon said, and say there's very little chance she wins. If she does, great. If she doesn't, well, she'll probably win next time. She'll probably will be the next leader of France. You think Macron can address any of the issues that drove people to Front National in the first place? They're not going to drop off as a party. It's not like UKIP, where they have a very, very slim amount of representation. Yes, and popular support in certain areas of the country, but ultimately still technically a minor party, all things considered. And they have, like, I think it was 1 or 2 people that were actually in their legislative body there. It's not like that. Front National is now the second largest party in France. It's probably going to remain at that threshold, with the far left rising up to erode the establishment further. The next time around, the establishment might not make the second ballot. You probably won't see a first ballot winner. It'll probably be the same story next time around. It'll be a far left candidate versus Le Pen, or versus whoever Le Pen puts in to go around next time. It'll probably be her, in all honesty. That will be probably what happens in France in a few years. So there's my prediction. Far left versus far right, again, so-called, in France next time around, with Le Pen probably winning. I'm going to say that several years in advance. Unless something miraculous happens, or the EU collapses. If the EU collapses before then you don't really have those issues. It just starts to, rip apart at the seams, and it gets fundamentally overthrown. Either it gets totally reformed so it's not like the EU anymore, and there's only freedom of movement within Europe. You don't have the refugee crisis, maybe some less strangulating bureaucracy. That could stave off the far right and the far left. The center would come back because they would have accomplished something. But it's not clear that they want to or can actually get that accomplished. And that's the Herculean task before them if they want to stave off the Le Pens and the Hoffers of Europe. It's not going to happen. That's about all. Peace out.